Great guitar phrasing is just like great storytelling. Melodic grammar gives your phrases a sense of structure and flow, while melodic pronunciation gives them a unique voice and delivery. Today's lesson deals with one aspect of great phrasing that is often overlooked, using melodic punctuation to create memorable musical sentences that feel meaningful and intentional. So let's get right into it. How's it going, everyone? I'm Nate Comp from DYMECAST, and today's lesson is episode number 10 in our series that focuses on creating expressive guitar melodies using the power of emotional contrast. Back in episode 8, I had introduced these 5 important observations about melodic behavior. Number 1, not every scale note is created equal. Number 2, expressive melodies will intentionally balance the contrasting feelings of tension and resolution. And when it comes to telling a powerful musical story, it's important to remember that dissonance equals emotion. Number 3, every dissonant scale tone naturally wants to resolve to a consonant scale tone. And all things being equal, stepwise motion is the most satisfying way to make that resolution happen. Number 4, every note that you play is an invitation to be expressive, which means that the physical delivery of a melodic note is just as important as the note itself. And number 5, variations in melodic rhythm can dramatically change how you experience the musical emotions of tension and resolution. Now, when it comes to practicing melodic punctuation, we need to start with a few new observations, okay? So here's number 6. Variations in pitch direction, either ascending or descending, can dramatically change how you experience tension and resolution. Number 7. Variations in pitch distance from small to large can dramatically change how you feel consonance and dissonance. And number 8, the use of consecutive consonant scale tones will always sound good. In other words, when you skip or leap from one consonant note to another, it will always work. These new observations are directly related to the first type of melodic punctuation that you want to explore, which is the idea of chord tone punctuation. When I have my private students work on this concept, the first thing that I give them to practice is an exercise that was inspired by the melody that Karen Carpenter sings at the beginning of the song Superstar, which sounds like this, okay? So key of F minor, set up a drone chord here, okay? And the melody that she sings, okay? So long ago, okay? As far as the melodic contour or the shape of this phrase, we've got a stepwise falling tone resolution followed by a descending leap to a lower pitched consonance. And this one phrase was all that I needed to hear to design a practice routine that was based around developing this sound. So let's go through it. Here's how the Superstar exercise works. Choose a single drone chord to practice over, either major or minor, and begin by practicing falling tone resolutions, okay? I'm gonna stick with an F minor chord for these examples, so set up the drone chord first, and here's what falling tone resolutions would sound like on the high E string, using the tendency tones of an F minor scale. So I'm gonna have a whole step down to the root, a half step down to the 5th, a whole step down to the minor 3rd, and then a whole step down to the root again. Okay, so now I want to add some chord tone punctuation to each of those direct resolutions. And to do that, I'm going to play the next available consonant scale tone that lies below the one that I'm resolving to. Now, when I say below, I mean lower in pitch, okay? So the melodic contour for each phrase will sound like this. Stepwise falling tone resolution, followed by a descending skip or a descending leap to a lower pitched consonant. And this is the melodic contour that Karen Carpenter sang that really grabbed my ear. All right, so here's what that sounds like when I play in a linear fashion going down the fretboard. So here's my F minor drone chord. I want to do falling tones and then chord tone punctuation. To really internalize this sound, I also want to practice this across the strings in position like this. All right, so here's my F minor chord. All right, so for a more angular version of chord tone punctuation, I also like to leap down to an even lower pitched consonants. And I found that the easiest way to do this is often by skipping a string. So here's what that would sound like. So F minor drone chord. Now I'm going to have this type of punctuation. I also want to practice this idea moving across the strings in position, which would sound like this. So here's my F minor drone chord. Here's a slightly different version of position punctuation. Here is the second version of the Superstar exercise. Using the same drone chord, I want to begin by practicing rising tone resolutions. Okay, so here is my F minor again. And here's rising tone resolutions on the D string using the tendency tones from an F minor scale. So a whole step into the root from below, a half step into the third, whole step into the fifth, and whole step to the root. Now I want to add some chord tone punctuation to each of those direct resolutions. And this time I'm going to play the next available consonant scale tone that lies above the one that I'm resolving to. And once again, when I say above, I mean higher in pitch. Now the melodic shapes for each of these phrases will now sound like this. Stepwise rising tone resolution followed by an ascending skip or an ascending leap to a higher pitched consonants. So here's what that would sound like when I play linear. Okay, so F minor chord. So I want to do rising tone and then punctuation. I also want to practice this same idea across the strings in position, which would sound like this. So rising tone and then punctuation. For a more jagged sound, I will also practice leaping up to an even higher pitched consonants. And once again, the easiest way to do this is usually just by skipping a string. So here's what that sounds like with rising tone resolutions and then larger leaps for my punctuation. I also want to practice this idea of larger leaps by playing across the strings in position, which would sound like this. For the third version of the Superstar exercise, let's introduce a change in pitch direction. Using the same drone chord, I'm going to begin by practicing falling tone resolutions again. Okay, so let's say we do falling tone resolutions this time on the B string using tendency tones from the F minor scale. So I'm going to have a half step to the fifth, a whole step to the root, a whole step to the minor third, and then a half step to the fifth. This time around, I want to add in a different type of chord tone punctuation. So now I'm going to play the next available consonant scale tone that lies above the one that I'm resolving to. This creates a really cool contrasting melodic shape where I begin with a stepwise falling tone resolution, but then I follow that with an ascending skip or an ascending leap in the opposite pitch direction to a higher pitched consonants. So here's what that sounds like. over F minor. So falling tone and then ascend to punctuation. I also want to practice this same idea in position across the strings, which would sound like this. Falling tone and then ascending movement for the punctuation. For a more dramatic sound, I will also practice leaping up to an even higher pitched consonants. All right, so here's what that would sound like. Doing falling tone resolution and then a larger leap. I also want to practice that same idea of larger ascending leaps by playing across the strings in position, which would sound like this. For the fourth and final version of the Superstar exercise, let's continue with this idea of changes in pitch direction. Using the same drone chord, I want to begin by practicing rising tone resolutions. So here's what that would sound like on the high E string using rising tone resolutions from the F minor scale. Okay, so half step to the third, whole step to the root, whole step to the fifth, and then a half step to the third again. Now I'm going to add chord tone punctuation that uses the next available consonants that lies below the one that I'm resolving to. This creates another really cool contrasting melodic contour where I begin with a stepwise rising tone resolution followed by a descending skip or a descending leap in the opposite pitch direction to a lower pitched consonants, okay? So here's what that would sound like if I was playing over F minor linear, okay? So rising tone and then descending punctuation. I also want to practice this same idea playing across the strings in position, which would sound like this. I also like to practice leaping down to an even lower pitched consonants for a slightly different sound and a slightly different emotion. So here's what that sounds like if I play linear. All right. And finally, I want to practice this same idea of larger descending leaps, but across the strings in position, which would sound like this. Before I move on to the next series of examples, here is one more new observation about melodic behavior. Number 9. Dissonant scale tones tend to work the best when they are prepared by consonant scale tones. In other words, you can set up a dissonance and make it feel more musical by simply preceding it with a consonance. Now, this observation is directly related to one of my favorite pieces of melodic vocabulary, which is the neighbor tone. Okay, the whole idea of a neighbor tone is to play a melodic shape. It's actually pretty simple. You begin on a consonant scale tone, which is the preparation note, and then you use stepwise motion to move to a dissonant scale tone, and then you use the same stepwise motion to resolve back to the consonants that you started on. The analogy that I always make with a neighbor tone is that you live here, you go next door, and then you come home, okay? So if I was playing over that F minor chord again, I can do a lower neighbor from the root, or an upper neighbor from the root, a lower neighbor from the third, upper neighbor from the third, lower neighbor from the fifth, and upper neighbor from the fifth. The pitch distance as far as whole steps and half steps will depend on exactly which scale you are using to create these neighbor tone sounds. When it comes to melodic punctuation, the second thing that I have my private students work on is an exercise that was inspired by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers' very first hit song, Breakdown. And in that tune, guitarist Mike Campbell plays one of my favorite guitar hooks, okay? Key of A minor, okay? This melody. As far as melodic shape, this melody uses a combination of lower neighbor tones followed by chord tone punctuation. And in each phrase, the punctuation comes in the form of a descending leap to a lower pitched consonance. So just like with the Carpenters melody, this one little nugget of melodic phrasing was all I needed to create an entire practice routine based around developing this sound. So let's go through it. Here's how the breakdown exercise works. Just like before, begin by choosing a drone chord and start by practicing lower neighbor tones. Now, the Tom Petty tune is in the key of A minor, so I'm going to stick in that key center. So here's my A minor drone. And here's where practicing lower neighbor tones sounds like on the B string, using the tendency tones of an A minor scale. So I have a half step lower neighbor on the minor third, okay, a whole step lower neighbor on the root, whole step lower neighbor on the fifth, and then a half step lower neighbor on the minor third. So all together. To add some chord tone punctuation, I'm going to play the next available consonant scale tone that lies below the resolution note of the neighbor tone melody. And the melodic shape for each phrase will sound like this. Back and forth stepwise motion for the lower neighbor tone, followed by a descending skip or a descending leap to a lower pitched consonance. And this is the melodic contour that Mike Campbell played that really caught my ear. So here's what that sounds like when I play that in a linear fashion over an A minor drone chord. Okay, so lower neighbor tone and then punctuation. To really internalize the sound of this type of phrase, I also want to be able to practice this across the strings in position, which would sound like this. For a more angular version of this phrase, I will also practice leaping down to an even lower pitched consonance. All right, so here's what that would sound like if I was going to play over my A minor drone chord again, okay? Using lower neighbor tones with larger descending leaps. I also want to practice this idea of using larger descending leaps while playing in position across the strings, which would sound like this. For the the second version of the breakdown exercise, I'm going to flip around the melodic contour. So using the same drone chord, now I want to begin by practicing upper neighbor tones. So here's what that would sound like over A minor if I do upper neighbor tones on the G string using the tendency tones of an A minor scale. So whole step upper neighbor from the root, whole step upper neighbor from the minor third, half step upper neighbor from the fifth, and then a whole step upper neighbor from the root. For the chord tone punctuation, I'm going to play the next available consonant scale tone that lies above the resolution of the neighbor tone melody. Now, the melodic shape for each of these phrases will sound like this. Back and forth stepwise motion for the upper neighbor tone, followed by an ascending skip or an ascending leap to a higher pitched consonants. Here's what that would sound like if I play in a linear fashion, moving up the fretboard. So upper neighbor tone and then punctuation above. I also want to practice this same idea moving across the strings in position, which would sound like this. For more of a jagged or angular sound, I will actually leap up to an even higher pitched consonants after playing the neighbor tone. So here's what that sounds like moving in a linear fashion. I also want to practice this idea of larger ascending leaps for my chord tone punctuation by playing across the strings in position. So here's what that sounds like over A minor. For the third version of the breakdown exercise, let's modify the melodic shape. Using the same chord, I now want to go back to practicing lower neighbor tones. So here's what lower neighbor tones would sound like on the D string using the tendency tones of an A minor scale. So I'm going to have a lower neighbor below the fifth of a whole step, okay? A half step lower neighbor on the minor third, whole step lower neighbor on the root, and then whole step lower neighbor on the fifth. So all together. This time I'm going to change up the chord tone punctuation by playing the next available consonant scale tone that lies above the resolution note of that neighbor tone melody. And the melodic shape for each phrase will sound like this. Back and forth stepwise motion for a lower neighbor tone, followed by an ascending skip or an ascending leap to a higher pitched consonants. Okay, so here's what that would sound like over A minor if I was playing in a linear fashion. So. I also want to practice this same idea playing across the strings in position, which would sound like this. For more of a dramatic sound, I will change the chord tone punctuation to an ascending leap that goes up to an even higher pitched consonants. Okay, so here's what that would sound like doing some string skipping. I also want to practice this idea of a larger ascending leap for my punctuation by practicing across the strings in position, which would sound like this. For the fourth and final version of the breakdown exercise, let's continue to modify the melodic shape. I want to go back to practicing over the same drone chord, beginning with upper neighbor tones again. So here's what upper neighbor tones would sound like on the high E string, okay, using tendency tones from the A minor scale. So I'm going to have a half step upper neighbor on the fifth, whole step upper neighbor on the minor third, whole step upper neighbor on the root, and then a half step upper neighbor on the fifth. I'm going to change up the chord tone punctuation again by playing the next available consonant scale tone that lies below the resolution note of the neighbor tone melody. So the melodic shape for each of these phrases will sound like this. Back and forth stepwise motion for the upper neighbor tone, followed by a descending skip or a descending leap to a lower pitched consonant. And once again, this creates a really great contrast as far as changes in pitch direction. So here's what that would sound like playing in a linear fashion over our A minor drone chord. So upper neighbor and then descending punctuation. I also want to practice this same sound of an upper neighbor tone with descending punctuation by playing side to side or east to west in position. So here's what that sounds like over an A minor chord. I also like to practice leaping down to an even lower pitched consonants for a slightly different sound and a slightly different emotion. So here's what that sounds like if I was playing in more of a linear fashion over the A minor. So now we're going to have an upper neighbor tone with a larger descending leap for punctuation. And finally, I want to practice this same idea of larger descending moves for my punctuation by playing across the strings in position. So here's the last example over A minor. If you are part of our online community, DYMECAST Insider, I'll be posting a 24-page PDF chart that has all of these examples in it. So definitely check that out if you are a member. There's a link in the description below. The most important thing that I hope you will take away from today's lesson is this. Running up and down scales and hoping to find some magical secret to great phrasing is not a reliable way to develop melodic vocabulary. Instead, you need to start with something that already sounds good to you and then build from there. With the superstar exercise and the breakdown exercise, I started with something that already sounded musical to me, and then I created an exercise around that particular sound. And this is the system that I use for so many of my practice sessions. I hear something that I like that sounds musical, and then I come up with an organized way to further develop that idea with intention. I have my private students do the superstar and breakdown exercises over many different types of drone chords, and I also have them explore a whole variety of different kinds of dissonances by changing up the scale or mode being used for each example. Once you understand the basic idea of melodic punctuation, then you have to consider this. What is the rhythmic context and the rhythmic environment for each of these phrases? What is the melodic pronunciation and the physical delivery of each of these phrases? And how can I make melodic punctuation feel like a comma versus a question mark or a period or an exclamation point? These are all ideas that I'll be covering in the next video. So if you enjoyed this lesson, please hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss the next episode. If you have any questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.